Thank you, Brianna, for passing it along to me, and I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Education Northwest second and final webinar around culturally responsive evaluation. I'm Destiny McLennan, a research advisor at Education Northwest, and I want to begin by first acknowledging the land that I am on. And so while Education Northwest is located in Portland, Oregon, I am in Los Angeles, California, and I acknowledge that LA is on the traditional land of the Gabrielino Tongva people, and the connections of Indigenous peoples to this land continue today. We have a responsibility to honor these connections, and as these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, we strive to understand our place within the past, present, and future of these Indigenous lands by reflecting on our relationships with human and other than human relatives with whom it is shared. And so Education Northwest is a research, evaluation, and technical assistance firm. Our mission is to really use evidence to help partners solve educational challenges and improve learning. We hold over 50 years of experience partnering with schools, districts, communities, and other stakeholders to really help you meet their full potential. We provide high quality research, technical assistance, professional development, and evaluation services that address the most pressing education and youth services needs across the country. And so our guiding vision is a school system that provides an excellent and equitable education for all. And so again, I am Destiny, the lead for this technical assistance work, and a lot of my work typically focuses on understanding the decision-making practices of students as they kind of like pivot from high school to various pathways, including college, technical and training programs, the workforce, and others. But I really also focus on centering student voices using asset-based qualitative methods in research and evaluation. I really think decisions are often made for students without involving them. So I'm just really passionate about ensuring their voices are a part of policy, programmatic, and evaluation decisions, which really brings me to this work today. On this team is also Dr. Julie Petrakubi, the manager of this work. She holds over 20 years of experience in youth and community development research, evaluation, and practice. She provides evaluation and technical assistance to diverse initiatives, and her expertise lies in youth-adult partnerships, and you'll be hearing from her a little bit more today. And so as I mentioned earlier, this is the second webinar we're leading. Our first webinar, which you can find on the Elevate Youth California website under training and webinars, really focused on understanding what evaluation is and why we use it. We learned how to clarify our purpose, determine our evaluation questions, which we'll kind of revisit today, and explore approaches to evaluation, including culturally responsive evaluation and youth participatory evaluation. And we worked on developing a logic model and theory of action. Today's webinar will really cover a few qualitative methods. We'll get into developing some asset-based findings, sharing those findings, and engaging youth and other interested parties or stakeholders throughout the process. And so, of course, these two two-hour webinars are really not enough to cover all of these topics in great depth. And so we're also offering 1 hour individual consulting or coaching services, and I'll be sharing more on how to sign up for those later. And so we can dive right in by exploring some youth participatory in evaluation. And so if you were in that first webinar or watch it later, this culture responsive framework may look a little familiar. So culturally responsive evaluation really rejects culture-free evaluation and recognizes that culturally defined values and beliefs really lie at the heart of any evaluative effort. And so it's really attentive to power differentials. It really allows for the recognition of one's own connections and interactions with power, privilege, and whiteness, as well as one's own relationship to the community. But I do want to acknowledge that this framework, as you can see, centers cultural competency, but it's really difficult to claim or believe competency in another's culture. And so even the wording itself kind of feels a little impersonal and technical, right? And so as practitioners, we definitely want to challenge this and recognize that we cannot be competent in another culture, but the goal is to really be culturally responsive, and that requires some humility. And that really allows us to consider, what are the stories of this community and its people, and who is telling them? We can consider the dimensions of diversity, and consider which dimensions are most salient within the community and how power is distributed, both formally and informally. It really also allows us to consider the relationships that are valued or privileged, and what relationships are discouraged or forbidden. And so when we consider this culturally responsive framework, we really want to ask ourselves, how can youth be involved in each step, from preparing to sharing our findings? Maybe they're not involved entirely in the entire process, but are involved in some steps of the process, and we can consider which steps make the most sense for our evaluation goals. And so today we'll primarily be focusing on, engaging stakeholders, selecting and adapting instrumentation, or really, data collection methods, collecting the data, and then disseminating or sharing the results or findings. And so now I'd like to, break the ice a bit and engage us in some discussion. And so from your perspective, what are really the benefits of engaging youth in evaluation? And you can share, in the chat, or we can also, open this up to an allowed discussion. What are the benefits of engaging youth in evaluation? Thank you. So in the chat, I'm seeing, getting real perspectives of youth on the work, having their voices heard. Absolutely. They have a different perspective to offer. So really bringing that into the work. They gain experience, the youth, but also, staff, program staff, and leaders also gain perspective from that experience.
I'm going to jump in and say, because I'm driving, that a lot of times things we think youth need are not what they feel they need, and that disconnect can impact programs. So it's important to have their input.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Donna. I completely agree. Sometimes, we're kind of making decisions for our youth without really bringing in their perspective, and what we think they may be different from what they vocalize. So yeah, definitely agree with that.
I think it also gives us more accountability, because once we hear their voices and they're a part of evaluation, then we are held accountable for what changes we do in programming from those conversations, from that information. Mm-hmm. So it builds that higher accountability for service delivery, and that's how we should also be looking at it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for sharing that, Cynthia. I definitely agree that you hold us accountable in so many ways. Yes, I also see in the chat, it gives them more agency. Yes, well, continue, sitting on that and considering their benefits. Thank you all for sharing those responses. And really that brings us right into our next slide around, the benefits of engaging youth, which I think, you all hit on many of the points. And so for youth, some of the benefits that you all have mentioned of engaging them in evaluation really include amplifying the youth voice. It includes an increased positive youth development, increased leadership development, training and experience in research and evaluation, increased public speaking skills, a deeper sense of empowerment specifically for systemically excluded and marginalized youth, increased self-confidence and civic engagement, within the community and further. And, the list really continues. And then also, as you all also started to really touch on, is there are benefits that for programs as well when it comes to engaging youth in evaluation. And so it brings forth an increased quality of the evaluation, right? It improves and strengthens youth-centered programming. It can lead to increased and sustained youth engagement in programming and can really contribute to program development and capacity building. And so knowing these benefits to both programs and youth, or knowing the why to why we should engage youth in evaluation, we can really now think about how to engage youth, or as I mentioned earlier, the parts of evaluation that we can meaningfully engage youth, right? And so what does engaging youth look like, and what does it look like to really work in partnership with youth, whether it's on the full evaluation or on, like I said, parts of the evaluation. And so here I'll really turn it over to Julie, who I introduced earlier, to really go over what youth participation in evaluation can look like.
Thanks, Destiny. So y'all called out some really strong reasons why young people might want to engage and why adults might want to engage young people as partners in evaluation. To talk some more about what it actually looks like, what that can look like, all the different forms it can take, and what it takes to get there, we wanted to offer a framework for thinking about just first generally youth and adult relationships and what that can look like in a more power sharing dynamic. And so this is a framework. I don't know if folks have seen this before. If you have, let me know. It's one that I really like that is about, it's a framework about youth and adult empowerment. A lot of times when we talk about youth engagement, youth adult partnership, youth voice, a lot of times there's like a ladder framework where at the very top is youth directed and at the bottom is adult directed. This is a pyramid, and I like the pyramid because in the middle of the pyramid is this idea of shared control between youth and adults. And I'll kind of walk you through the pyramid, and then we'll talk some more about what this means for evaluation. I also want to say this pyramid comes from an article by Wong, Zimmerman, and Parker, and we're kind of overlaying some work by Checkaway and Richard Schuster around evaluation to talk about this, youth participatory evaluation. So on the far left, you see on adult control. These are the things, this is kind of business as usual for a lot of young people's lives. Adults are making the decisions, they're driving what happens in the setting, whether it's home, school, family, our programs. And then we start to see empowerment increase where adults start to consult more with young people. They give them opportunities for voice. And we call that maybe symbolic participation, or there's a little bit more opportunity for empowerment, but it's not really the deepest opportunity for empowerment. In the middle, we have shared control where both youth and adults have a role to play. They have expertise to bring, resources to bring to the conversation, and they're both really experiencing, we believe, the most empowerment because they're both getting something from the process and giving something to the process. And then as you start to move on the right, we start to move more towards more youth-directed, youth-driven spaces, which are incredibly important as well, where in the independent model, young people have a voice and an active role, but adults are really given, adults are still there, but they're really more a little bit, when I worked with young people, they talk about the adults stepping up and stepping back. And so the adults are always there behind them. They can reach out when they need support. The youth are really leading and making most of the decisions. And then at the far right, you have autonomous. And these are those youth-driven organizations where they might have an adult staff that they work with, but it's really staffed by young people, the board are young people. They're driving all the decisions there. And so this is just kind of mapping a little bit, helping us to walk the talk some more of what it means to engage young people as partners and to think about where am I in this continuum? Where's my program? Where are we engaging people as partners, really sharing control? Where are there spaces where young people are really driving? Where are there spaces where the adults are driving? You can see all of these things in the same setting. A couple of things I want to say. This will vary by what you have going on. So maybe, how you run your everyday program, maybe there's more opportunities for you to share control. How you run your organization, it might be more adult directed or vice versa. There's different kind of ways that you might think about partnership. There's not just one way of doing it. It really does vary. And it does vary with the characteristics and interests of the young people. Not every young person wants to be driving every decision. They might want to come and just participate. Sometimes they want to really be playing a more active role. So I like this pyramid because it gives us a way of thinking about it, and that's more nuanced than some of the other models out there. And so before we start talking about evaluation and what it means for youth evaluation, I just want to see, does this resonate with you? Is this what it's like in your program? What would you push back on? Feel free to either speak out or jump into the chat. I see we've got a couple of chat comments already.
I think that partnerships between youth and adults are so important, and being able to work together. And I definitely see the value of the autonomous and independent, but I do really like that. I think, I am used to the Hearts ladder, and sometimes they're not ready, or they just want to come and participate, or they want their voices heard, but they're not ready to lead the charge yet. So I think this is brilliant. I'm really glad you shared that.
Thanks, Italy. I really love this model. It really speaks to me, and I find it reflects the diversity of experiences. Anyone else?
I really appreciate this diagram because I feel like with as serving youth, they grow up, right? So then you have a new, fresh youth that come into programming. And so depending on that group that comes in, they might be on a different side, or so you have to really learn how to flow and meet where they are, but strive and push towards the pluralistic piece. But if they are really hard, they're really reserved, they can't really come out of their shell yet, then you're going to be more on the left side, and then you have to work towards getting to that pluralistic piece. Or they can come in saying we're going to do it all, right? But then, okay, let's meet in the middle so we have guide and support from adults in the space. So just really being flexible and not saying that every single youth that comes in or every group of youth are going to be essentially the same dynamic. Because in our programming, every year it changes. If one very strong youth leaves programming, the dynamic shifts. And so it just becomes this little piece of we are dealing with humans that are in constant change. So we do have to be flexible on where they are on this triangle.
Yeah, and I would add that where the adults are too. And
Yeah.
so I think you're calling out this idea that it can be, as somebody else wrote about, a pathway or progression. And so how do we think about building young people's capacity to take on these different roles in different settings? And how do we build our own capacity to partner with young people? Because this isn't what we're necessarily trained or accustomed to doing. And how do we make sure, as someone who's researched these spaces, sometimes I see folks think that youth adult partnership or youth voice is about adults completely stepping back. And sometimes adults can step so far back that young people don't have the support they need and their access to resources and knowledge. Adults have things to bring as well. And so really using something like this to think about where are we, where do we want to go, what would it take to get there so our adults are able to support young people, and what capacity do young people need to step into these leadership roles given that they're not always given the opportunity to be in these spaces? How do we prepare them to understand the norms of a setting, the practices they need? In this case, we'll be talking about evaluation. How do we introduce them to what that looks like so they feel really confident to implement? Any other thoughts that you'd want to share before we start to talk about that? All right, so let's overlay what this means for evaluation. And so when we think about the different roles of evaluation and designing an evaluation, carrying out an evaluation, collecting the data, analyzing the data, and using the results, there's different ways to think about the roles of young people. Most often, young people are conceived as subjects or participants in evaluation. They take the survey, they are asked to participate in a focus group, they're observed, they don't necessarily know why, how the information is going to be used, they don't have a say in what's being done, but they're really more what we might conventionally call subjects or participants in an evaluation. This is the most common experience. We're starting to more and more see young people engaged as consultants. And so this could take a lot of different forms. This could be working with young people to design a protocol, getting their input on a protocol that adults develop. Does this resonate with you? You could get their feedback on a survey. You could have a youth advisory committee who is giving you advice, but again, it's adult directed. Young people have a role to play. They're learning about evaluation. They're giving you feedback, but it's still the adults who are making the decisions. Youth as partners is when you start to see young people playing more active roles in the process. So maybe young people are working with the adults to design the data collection. They're more actually, developing the questions themselves. They are posing the questions, figuring out the direction of the evaluation. They're maybe collecting data alongside and with support from adults. You start to see more close collaboration between youth and adults, where maybe adults are still kind of creating the opportunity, helping to bring the resources, training the young people, but there's a role that's really clear and agentic for young people where they're making decisions, that they're taking action, that this is something that they're co-owning with adults. That's youth as partners. And then we start to go on the other side of the continuum where youth are completely driving it themselves. And so they may engage adults to access certain kinds of expertise. They may engage adults to access resources, but the adults are really pretty much in the background with youth making most of the decisions in how the evaluation operates. And so I'm gonna transition to Destiny to have you all engage in an activity to think about first, like, where's your organization overall on this pyramid? What are the types of experiences your youth and staff have? And then what would that mean for how you think about engaging young people in evaluation?
Thanks, Julie. And so, yeah, as she shared, we'll engage in activity focused around engaging youth in certain steps of responsive evaluation and really considering that model or that pyramid that was just presented. And so we will be using Jamboard, in which I'll show you in just a moment, but we'll enter into random breakout rooms of about 5 people. Your breakout room number will correspond to the Jamboard sheet you'll go to. And then really thinking about some of the culturally responsive evaluation steps, you'll populate the Jamboard with your responses to where are you now in regards to engaging youth in evaluation, where do you want to move and why. So let me just pull up the Jamboard to show you what this kind of looks like. And so again, like you'll swipe to the seat number that corresponds to your breakout room. So if you're in breakout room 3, you'll head over to the 3rd page of the Jamboard, and this is where you'll work with your group. If you're breakout room 5, you'll swipe to the 5th sheet of the Jamboard. And then so you can populate the Jamboard using sticky notes, you can do text box, just ensure that you kind of begin to engage in discussion with your group around these questions. So maybe share a bit with your group about your program and your evaluation goals, and really share with one another your responses to these questions. You really may be able to learn some strategies from one another and maybe just, bounce some ideas off one another. And then Julie and I will kind of bounce around to a few groups who just kind of, observe, maybe chime in a bit. And so we'll be in these breakout rooms for about 10 minutes, and then I'll bring us back to the larger room where we'll share out some things that may have come up in your group. And so let me actually copy and paste the Jamboard link into the chat. Maybe take a moment to go to that link before I open these breakout rooms. And let me go ahead and start creating those rooms. Okay. So I'm opening the rooms now, and again, just make sure that your room number corresponds to the sheet that you work in. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you all for participating in that activity. I bounced around a few groups and heard, really, really cool things about how you all are really engaging youth voice in programming activities and such, as well as ways you want to engage youth in evaluation goals. And so, yeah, I'm interested in hearing, if anyone wants to share some interesting things that came up in your group, whether it's in the chat or aloud again, around, where you're engaging youth in certain parts of evaluation, where you want to be and why, and, what other conversations this may have sparked within your group. So I'll open it up.
I'll speak for our group, Destiny. I think for us, when we were talking, it's a lot of, we want our youth to be able to build that capacity within themselves. And so we do have some, what we called like a hybrid. We do have some adult driven control, and then we try and focus on the youth having that and trying to set them up for going out of our program as a step or two better than when they came in. Mm-hmm. So empowering them to be able to do those things on their own. I mean, they're not going to take over our programs, but they'll be able to do something within them, within their own capacity.
Now I was talking about, so my program, Kids in the Spotlight, is very much like youth led, because it is a filmmaking program. in which the youth get to make the film, they write it, and they get to perform in it. So, and it's all about allowing them to tell their story. So for the most part, it kind of, they have to be the ones leading it. They have to be the ones, deciding what they want to write, what they want to say. And so they're very much encouraged to voice their opinions and write what they really feel like they want to write. I mean, obviously within some parameters, and there are adults there and instructors there to guide them and make sure they're going in the right direction and, clearly saying what they want to. But for the most part, it is heavily youth reliant or youth led.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Joey. And I dropped in on Joey's group a bit, and yeah, we'll get into it a bit later, but those aspects of, those storytelling pieces or certain components of, your program activities can be turned into data as well, when it comes to pursuing your evaluation goals. So anyone else want to share?
Also,
Sure,
oh, go ahead.
no, you can go for it, Cynthia. I'll go after you.
Okay, I just wanted to quickly share in group 2, we kind of talked about that we're all kind of in the same place of, incorporating them in the development of evaluation, where it's very adult centered right now, but how can we make that shift into youth adult partnership? I think we do a great job of incorporating youth in decision making for programming purposes, but it never really came up about how that can translate in actual evaluation. And kind of, we talked about youth are experts in engaging their peers and engaging their community. And so why not have them be experts in the collecting the data? So as they're partnering in the development stage, but they're leading the collection of data, and then we go back to partnership and sharing what we've learned, then that really gives them guidance on, that learning element of evaluation, but they really are going to take it to the next level on engaging their peers and community, because they're going to trust them to give and collect data. So just kind of, that element of how do we translate what we already do with programming and involving youth into the evaluation.
Yes, and we'll be getting right into that in just a few slides. Thank you for kind of pivoting us there, Cynthia.
This is Jen. So we're group 6, and in our group, we had varied responses. So for example, my organization, Connected to Lead, we were founded in 2019. And so with our current funding for the Elevate Youth Grant, we are in the process of working on recruitment, and our goal is to have a youth board and youth leaders who will in turn help us develop the adult youth partnership. That's always been a focus of ours and wanting to make sure that happens. But we just aren't at the place right now where that's happening. So we're kind of nowhere, right? But we know where we want to be and where we're headed. And then we had a few folks say that right now they're currently more adult-led, and they and maybe some of their colleagues have been looking at how to shift that to more youth-led. And then we had another organization who mentioned that there are currently youth and adult partnership based, and their goal is to continue to be youth and adult partnership based.
Thank you, Jen, for sharing that. I think, yeah, you brought up an important piece around, we know where we want to go, and we know, what the goal of our evaluation efforts are when it comes to engaging youth. And I think that's a really, really important step. And so pivoting a bit, let me go ahead and share my screen to really getting into, some qualitative methods that'll really help engage youth in evaluation. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Julie to kind of begin that.
Hi, everyone. It's so exciting to see that a lot of you are in the place of moving towards youth adult partnership or youth-driven evaluation. What we're going to talk about today in this point is kind of go back a little bit to some of the big picture ideas in evaluation and start to think about the opportunities for your methods to engage young people as partners, but also even when they're participating in evaluation, what are some methodologies, some qualitative methodologies that might further provide more opportunity for them to express agency and empowerment and voice, even if they're not the data collectors or designers, but they could absolutely be doing this themselves. So I just wanted to kind of offer that frame as we go into it. First, we're going to talk about what are qualitative methods. Qualitative methods are narrative and open-ended information. So these are folks' kind of ideas, self-expression. Oh, thank you, Palvinder. Yes, ways of kind of, you often think about qualitative data as the words and quantitative data as numbers. It's not always that distinct, but that's one way to think about it. Qualitative data will help you show why or how something happened. It really start to unpack the ideas behind numbers in a lot of cases. The examples of qualitative data are interviews, focus groups, open-ended survey questions where you're putting out a prompt and folks can answer however they want. Observation or participant observation, where you're sitting in and observing things and taking notes and analyzing what you see. And artifact review. And artifact review can be a lot of different things. It can be analyzing photos, video, artwork, performances, text. It can be a lot of different things, but that's an example of qualitative data. So you're really looking to identify themes in these types of information. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the reasons we do evaluation, the types of evaluation questions you might have based on the purpose of your evaluation. For those of you who are in our first webinar, this will be familiar to you. There's maybe three, and there's probably other purposes, but there's three main purposes we would think about with evaluation. One is developmental evaluation, and this is when you're doing an evaluation maybe to develop a new program or figuring out how to address an issue. They're really big picture questions about what's going on here? What is the issue or situation in our community? And how does this relate to other things that are happening? So it could be that you're looking to address something like food security in the community. You might collect information. Again, this is where it overlaps a lot with YPAR. To understand what's going on, you might do community mapping to really see what that looks like. Photo voice is an example of a qualitative method that might be used in developmental evaluation, where you're really trying to understand the bigger picture, what's happening, and how a program or some sort of a policy might be designed in response to what's happening to really address the root cause of an issue. Formative evaluation is when you have a program up and running and you want to see how can I make that program better? How is it perceived by participants? So you're asking questions about your program activities and the practices that you're using in your program. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of the program from the perspective of participants? Who is the program working for? What parts of the program are working well, and under what conditions? So these are questions really centering on the young people's experience of the program. So we often use focus groups to do that. You can also use visual displays. We're asking young people to illustrate their experiences in the program. What was it like when you first came on? What did you experience here? What elements of the program really led to a change for you? What would you tell other students, young people about your program? So you can do a lot of different kinds of qualitative methods, really surfacing and unpacking and analyzing how young people experience the program and how different groups of young people experience the program. Including young people who've left the program, who don't participate, really understanding why it didn't work for them and how you might use that information to improve the work that you're doing. So formative evaluation is where you're asking questions about how we can really improve what we're doing to better support young people. And then summative evaluation is where you're looking at, okay, did we really make a difference? And did we make a difference in the long term for the young people that we're trying to serve? Do we meet the outcomes that we're trying to work towards? A lot of times qualitative methods are used in relationship to quantitative methods at this point to really unpack and illustrate some of the stories to provide some stories behind the numbers. So you might do some in-depth interviews, you might do some of the really cool methods that Destiny is going to share in a few minutes to really illustrate some of the to really understand how, if you're presenting number or numerical information, who are the people behind that and what is their perspective? And so qualitative methods can be used at all of these points and are a nice way to literally amplify the voices of young people in your programs and the young people you are engaging and that you want to engage. And so Destiny's going to share some really interesting methods that are ones that you and your young people that you work with might want to consider integrating into your evaluation work.
Thank you. And yeah, so returning to that pyramid model for youth participation and evaluation, adult and youth shared control in qualitative data collection works if evaluators use methods accessible for both youth and adults to learn. It works if evaluators share various types of models and tools with youth and give them a voice in selecting methods. And really, if evaluators select methods that appeal to youth and pique interest and excitement. And so a few methods that do this include walking interviews, storytelling methods, including testimonials and autoethnography, and I'll get into these a little bit more in depth. And so walking interviews can really take many forms, including the docent and go-along method. And so the docent method really engages youth by recognizing them as the expert interviewee. And so they escort the interviewer through the walking tour, deciding where they want to go and what they want to show. Then there's the go-along method, in which the interviewer accompanies a participant in a normally occurring outing. So this can be an interviewer tagging along to a youth journey home after program activities or to the program site from home. And there are many more types of walking interviews that you can explore in this provided resources box. But walking interviews really can provide context to interviewees' experiences, really allowing them to contextualize their personal stories. And so it explores student perceptions of the structures, of the actors, of the processes that really shape youth's environment. And so it really allows for a deeper exploration of youth experiences within the space, as well as, the social and institutional factors that really shape these experiences. And so it kind of mitigates some of the limitations that comes with the traditional sit-down interview, because that kind of interview can sometimes exaggerate certain power dynamics between the interviewer and the interviewee. But the walking interview really kind of provides some of that power back to the youth and considers them as the expert. And so these types of interviews can really answer questions around the context and settings that youth are situated in and how they navigate such settings, like the community or their neighborhood impact. And so a broad question that, a walking interview can cover is like, how has youth engagement in program activism been affected or strengthened by their neighborhood settings? And so in some of my work, I have utilized walking interviews to really understand how Black students specifically, how their neighborhoods affected their decisions to attend college or not. As I said earlier, a lot of my work is focused on, the decision-making practices of youth. But I've also used and modified this method into kind of a virtual version of a walking interview. And this was a part of an evaluation in which we focused on kind of understanding how accessible and how comprehensive a basic needs service program was on campus, on a college campus. And I know that from speaking with some of you in some of our individual coaching sessions, I know you may be interested in exploring youth perceptions of cannabis use, considering the amount of, dispensaries in the neighborhood. So an example evaluation question could be, how have cannabis dispensaries in systemically marginalized communities affected youth perceptions toward cannabis use? And so a walking interview would then help youth better articulate, how this happens. They'll be able to point to, some of these dispensaries and talk about, the impact that it has had on them. And then this can then inform some program practices to address this. Another example is if your program is situated on a ranch or a farm, a walking interview throughout the ranch or farm can really help youth better describe components of the program that benefit them, and components that can be improved as well to better serve them. And so to really utilize this method, an evaluator would, develop a semi-structured interview questionnaire. They decide on the most appropriate type of walking interview method. They'd inform youth about this method and explain to youth why you're using it. You want to inform youth of evaluation questions and the purpose of the evaluation. And while conducting the interview, you really want to ensure that you're asking probing questions, if they're not already on your semi-structured interview, or other probing questions may come up as you're walking around with the youth that may be focused on, if it is a walking interview in their neighborhood, it may be focused on, where they hang out, places they may avoid, and how that has shaped their perceptions of, if we consider this example of cannabis use. maybe their favorite places that they like to explore. So whatever is useful to your evaluation purpose is something that you kind of want to probe around. And I just think it's really important to be very just clear and transparent with you about your purpose for the walking interview. And then storytelling as a method is essentially, personal stories describing experiences and perspectives from a particular point of view. And so examples of these can include testimonies and autoethnography. Testimonies are typically grounded in recognizing oppressive structures and the resiliency utilized in navigating such structures. And so it's important, or it supports youth who have been marginalized or systemically excluded in sharing their own personal stories, narratives, and histories, and allows them to really resist historically stereotypical narratives. And then autoethnographies are kind of like autobiographies, but really puts the self at the center of the evaluation. And so it understands the relationship between the self and others. It combines autobiography with ethnography, and ethnography is a method where people and their behaviors are observed and researched in their natural settings. And so if not done correctly, ethnography can be very appropriative, which is why autoethnography really gives folks the opportunity to be in control of their own narrative. So it will give youth the opportunity to be in control of their own narrative, of their own stories. And I'll get more into these in just a bit. But from these storytelling methods, we can really learn about youth experiences and their placement in the world, and really how to make sense of such. I also want to say here that storytelling methods can really take shape in many forms. It can include oral and written stories. It can include songs, poems, spoken word, rap, images, artwork, and more. It really allows for the recognition of both the evaluator or interviewer or program staff member and the participant or interviewee to really be in a relationship with one another. So again, it's kind of breaking down of power dynamics again, right? And so it allows for, multiple truths and changing knowledge. And so the evaluator, again, or the interviewer or that program staff member that's conducting that evaluation or conducting data collection is really aware of their own positionality and their own biases and recognizes the participant as the expert. So again, breaking down those power dynamics. And so kind of diving into testimonials and autoethnography a little bit more. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, testimonials really allow individuals to name their own realities and share specific experiences of oppression or trauma that they have endured and potentially navigated through. And so the goal of the testimonial is to name oppression and to kind of arrest those actions, whether it's genocide, racism, classism, or any other type of institutionalized marginalization. And so really the aim is to speak for justice against all crimes against humanity. And you can learn more about this and its origins in this linked resource on this slide. And so some of you may already be engaging in this type of work as part of your programming activities. If you're doing things like mental health support groups, if you're engaging in mentoring or peer mentoring, some social justice workshops and courses, curriculum around social justice, journaling activities, and more. And so turning these activities into data for an evaluation really include you want to ensure you're receiving consent from the youth whenever you use their personal testimonials as data. And you want to leave testimonials as is. That doesn't mean you can't analyze and discuss, the testimonial itself, but if you are sharing the testimonial, with stakeholders or with other interested parties, you want to leave that testimonial as is, or really you want to have youth share their testimonial if they feel, empowered to. Of course, we don't want to force youth to share, their testimonials with anyone they don't want to. And if you are using this in your final product of your evaluation, you definitely want to ensure that you de-identify youth. So you want to make it completely anonymous. And so an example of how testimonials have been used in education work really include using testimonials to talk about youth experiences in succeeding in college. And so data from these testimonials has been used to make system level changes in institutions and then to provide more support and resources to these students. And so in your program, testimonials can really be used to document youth experiences and understand the resources and support they need. As I kind of mentioned earlier, and I think we keep coming back to this idea that decisions are often made on what program strategies and practices to use to support youth without ever hearing from youth themselves on what they need. And so this method can really help document, what they need while also highlighting what's working and what's impactful to youth within the program. And that information could be important for, your various stakeholders, including families, other youth, and even funders. And then so getting into autoethnography a bit, they're pretty similar to testimonials, except it really allows for connection of the personal to the evaluation itself. And so, again, similar to testimonials, you may already be engaging in this type of work in certain program activities. This can include journaling or, again, media and social justice curricula and campaigns. And so in autoethnography, if the data collection is adult controlled, meaning if it's adults interviewing youth and collecting data from youth, it's the adults who can engage in this autoethnographic work. So it will embed the adult in the setting and really allows the adult to understand, again, their own biases, their own positionalities, and the importance of the work to themselves. Adults can journal on, why they do this work, why they're utilizing particular methods, and how they're engaging youth in the process. Now, if this person is more youth controlled and youth are doing certain data collection activities, maybe interviewing other youth or staff or observing program activities, they can use autoethnography to document their experiences as an evaluator of the program in which they're also a participant. So they're already embedded in the context. And so you'd really want to encourage youth to document their experiences in the form that best suits them. And you really want to caution them to not only focus on the self, but really engage with themselves as a part of this larger programming and have youth share their own work, of course. So an example of what this looks like, I know I've heard some of you, again, in those individual coaching sessions, speak to some of your program activities and strategies that you include. And this, I've heard that some of you may have curricula around media campaigns around Prop 64, or you have social justice campaigns that focus on microaggressions and imposter syndrome. And then so having youth kind of document their experiences of participating in this particular activity while they're participating in the activity could then be used as a data point to show the value of that particular activity. So if they are doing a media campaign around Proposition 64 and they're documenting what that experience is like, again, it can show how this activity is working and how it can possibly be improved. And so I do want to say that autoethnography and testimonials probably wouldn't be the only method you'd utilize in evaluation, and you'd want to combine this with some other data collection methods, but they really, really, really are helpful at getting at, youth experience. And so I just, also want to highlight that these methods that I've just discussed, the walking interviews, the testimonials, autoethnography, they're pretty, they sit comfortably in social science research, but they're pretty new and groundbreaking when it comes to program evaluation. So I really want to emphasize, again, using multiple forms of data collection and evaluation where it can really enhance the credibility of your findings and learnings. I see we have a question here. I see a hand raised. I think it's Keatron. I don't want to.
Oh, you got you got it correct. Thank you. Keatron with Classy. And I just had just a quick question as you were going through this. Our program is like 90% virtual, 10% in person. So we do collect a lot of data, like videos and things like that. I guess my question is going to be a little bit off-putting because we're getting a lot of transparent feedback, and sometimes it makes me a little bit nervous when we're talking about social justice and how to present these things. And I just wanted to know what feedback could be applied when we're dealing with these sensitive cases, because the youth that we're working with, they're very transparent, they're very articulate, they are addressing things that are not being addressed. And it just makes me a little bit nervous, putting them in this position to be able to utilize their voice, because I am concerned about backlash. is that a realistic scenario? Because we're talking about sensitive things, and I know that the data that we have, it supports all these structures, but it is very honest, like their perspectives on cannabis use, and they have such a grand understanding of like what's going on politically and socially. And when we're getting their feedback, like we have a production studio, and when we're getting their feedback, it is very transparent, especially when we talk about social injustice and it's going on in like school districts and certain policies, like they're calling it out. But I'm just nervous, like in terms of showcasing this. Have you guys had any experience with like the honesty of it all, and then like any backlash?
So I do think, feeling that way is definitely, you're right to feel that way. I will say when, in these types of programs, in programs where we want to really enhance or increase youth development in leadership and youth activism, that can definitely come up often. I guess it really, I think that's more of a programmatic thing in which you want to, really share how you are engaging in activism. And so I think on the evaluation side, it depends on the type of data you're interested in collecting. But when it comes to like youth really calling out certain structures or calling out certain issues that's happening socially and politically, et cetera, I think you will definitely have some backlash. There will be stakeholders that are opponents and that are skeptical of that work. And it's really just around, kind of figuring out how to share that or how to engage those stakeholders, knowing that you'll kind of receive that backlash.
Okay, that makes sense.
I'd like to make a comment for Kedrian,
yes.
Yeah. This is Dr. Shanshuri. I had two comments based on your question. One was our organization, takes the time up front to set the tone for the intent and purpose of what we're doing. So if you take that time up front and educate the parents, because you're going to have a difference of opinion depending on whether they're youth under age of 18 versus adults who can make a decision for themselves that are 18 and older. But if you set that tone with everyone, including the parents and the youth that are under the age of 18, of how you're going to handle disseminating, managing, controlling, archiving, and disclosing information about their input. So you do that up front. Two, the question becomes, are you doing it as a group? If you're doing it as a group, how you're handling it versus when you're doing it with individuals, and the anonymity versus the non-disclosure of private information and content that youth might share that they may or may not be comfortable with sharing, and asking them up front whether or not their input that they share with you can be used in any way that would disclose sensitive information. So if you want to take it offline and have a discussion about how we've been doing it and handling it, we haven't had too much of a conflict from it, because we set the tone up front to let them know that if we intend to use it for any reason, that we would get their permission. And so
yeah, that part, Dr. Chinchuri, is that part we have structured. I guess it's just me personally, just like because they want their voices to be heard on social media and things like that. So it's more the external things, not the parents are on board, the youth are like, we have all of that covered, but I didn't expect for the information that we're providing to them and these platforms was going to take they were going to take it to the next level. And that's what's really surprising. So it just makes me more concerned socially, like people, like our social media platforms that this information is going out to, like they do things on mental health and certain structures, and they have very great feedback and they're very well spoken. However, it's just externally, once we put that information out there, that's the kind of thing that I'm concerned about. Like having youth that have this much knowledge, it's not something that's often presented in the capacity that we're presenting. We had like over like 90,000 impressions from one of the youth giving feedback about what structures and resources youth needed returning to school. So it's that type of output, like socially, when it's out to the public, that's that we've never
Right.
had this much of a response.
Mhm.
With the feedback for them giving on youth. But this is very helpful. So I was just curious on how to manage that, because they are speaking about very sensitive matters and they're young and they have a lot of information.
Right. So just so we know, I'd like to take it offline and talk with you
Okay,
more about it, because
sure.
I do think that some of our experiences overlap, and there
Okay,
could be some things that we're doing that you might want to utilize.
absolutely. Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Okay.
I think you could also talk to the youth about it. Like,
Okay,
I think it's always just say, hey, you're going to get a lot of information, and like train them how to properly put out that information, or instead of just putting out the information or say do this, just like, hey, if you know any of your friends or if you notice something is happening, you could always like link this number or this email so they can contact us, so they're not getting secondhand or third-hand information.
got it.
I feel like that. I feel like when it comes to things like that, it's like the youth really care and they're really trying to help. Most of the time, they
Mhm.
will just refer,
Okay,
whoever they know to where to get those proper um help from. And I think when it comes to like you said, like you're bored or whatever, it's 2022. You're not gonna control what people post on the internet. You can
yeah,
try.
true.
That's just the reality of
Right,
living in this day and age with technology. Like kids have access to the internet,
yeah,
and you just let them know, hey, we try our best to make sure the information that they put out there is, lining up with, our morals and our values and whatever. However, the reality is we will not be able to control all of it.
okay, that makes sense, Joey. Thank you. I appreciate that feedback. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah, thank you all for that conversation. I think, that really helped me as well. And it actually really kind of brings me to this point on, recognizing youth voice as both, a process and an outcome. And so, we don't want evaluation, or we recognize that evaluation is not only to determine, the worth or the merit or the value or effectiveness of a program, but it can also be used to really improve and further develop program effectiveness. And so not just using program evaluation, again, to show effectiveness and success, but to understand how it can be improved. And, just recognizing that it's important for the sustained engagement of youth. It's not just about showing that this worked in these amount of years, but in order to really have sustained engagement of youth within our programs, we really need to utilize methods that can help us improve. And the value of these methods that I just kind of went over really lie in learning, what youth experiences are, and they really allow youth voice to come through and be amplified. And so again, like combining these methods with other, qualitative or quantitative methods, like traditional sit-down interviews, focus groups, surveys and more, could really help to kind of get at that effectiveness piece, but also get at that youth voice and improvement piece. And you can find out more about, some of those other methods in the Learning for Action webinar. It's also on the Elevate Youth website under training and webinars. But thank you all, for that. I think kind of bringing it back to what Joey said, it's really like talking to the youth about it and really getting their voice and perspective in all of this. And so moving into our second activity, and sitting on those methods for a little bit longer, we'll use a Jamboard again, and I'll show you again in just a moment, but we'll enter into random breakout rooms again. You'll swipe to the seat that your breakout room number corresponds to, and you'll really use the Jamboard tools to match data collection methods to the provided example questions. And you'll engage in conversation around why this method, how does this method provide opportunities for youth adult partnerships, and what capacity do youth and adults need to do this? And so this Jamboard looks a little like this. So yeah, you can use the tools on the right to kind of match one of the questions to, the methods. And we'll, again, take about 10 minutes to do this and to have discussion questions are right up here. Why this method? How does this method provide opportunities for youth and adult partnerships? And what capacity do youth and adults need to do this? So let me, again, paste this Jamboard link into the chat. And let me open up the breakout room. Okay, it looks like we're all back. I think there was a little confusion in some groups, so I did want to kind of open it up, and thank you all, for kind of engaging in that activity. But I do want to open it up, and maybe we can just have a discussion around, some things that came up in your group, or if there was any hesitancy that came with matching some of the questions, the provided questions with some of the methods. Yeah, we can just share aloud, maybe any opportunities for youth partnerships that came up or building capacity for using these methods.
This is Jen. I can share. So in our group, yes, as you mentioned, there was a little confusion at first. We actually didn't get to the discussion questions because we started with the matching aspect. And it's interesting too, as I look through what some of the other groups came up with in regards to the matching piece. So for our group, how do youth perceive adult support? We chose auto, and we're calling it auto because we had a few challenges saying it. For number 2, we also chose auto. For number 3, we chose walking interviews in auto. And then for number 4, we chose testimonials in auto. And it seemed like auto was really one that we really liked. So we didn't get to the discussion questions, as I mentioned.
No, thank you for sharing that. And, can anyone else kind of resonate with some of those responses? And I'll kind of share just to show you all those responses that came up. Oops. Apologies on that. Or any just, questions or discussion points that came up. I know I bounced around in some groups, and it seems like, we were still kind of sharing about, kind of how to start engaging youth in some of these evaluation, in some of our evaluation goals and some methods or other methods we've been utilizing. Well, this is an activity you can, continue coming back to, and you can kind of, as you develop your own evaluation questions, you may already have some, but as you develop them and maybe you're developing those questions in partnership with youth, you can kind of engage youth in determining some of those evaluation methods, which I actually begin talking about here. And so some things to consider in supporting adult and youth shared control and evaluation includes, ensuring the capacity and resources, ensuring that you all have the evaluation capacity and resources. And so that can look like really staying attuned to youth schedules, providing compensation whenever, available, and providing some training to youth, because I think one of the groups that I dropped into talked about, how youth can be like a little overwhelmed and overburdened. And sometimes when we, really push it all on youth and have it more youth controlled, we need to ensure that, we're providing them with the tools so that they don't feel overburdened, so that they do feel supported. And so some training in like ethics, some training in data collection methods, some training in, how to identify bias and understanding their own positionality when it comes to, being the participant of the program, but then also being an evaluator or participating in the evaluation of the program. And then, some training in identifying assets and being asset-based. I was a part of an evaluation where we interviewed alumni of a program about their experiences in that program. And then we had those same alumni who were still used interview current program participants. And so these alumni were compensated both for their time for being interviewed, participating in the interview, but they were also compensated for their time in interviewing other youth. And then we also provided these alumni with training in how to effectively interview, how to recognize their positionality and bias and how to be asset-based. And so the training wasn't just, a PowerPoint presentation, but was very conversational and interactive. And we incorporated opportunities to kind of role play and practice when it came to interviewing. And so that really brings me into that point of using active learning, engaging and team building meetings when partnering with youth in evaluation. And so the Youth Participatory Action Research Hub at UC Berkeley really has some good resources in engaging youth in this work. An example they provide that utilizes engaged learning activities include, having youth look at news reports of the same story from 2 different outlets and developing guiding questions that really allows them to identify bias. And then, so if they're able to pinpoint it, they can then recognize it, within themselves and understand their own positionality. They also provide another example, which is around kind of like bubble mapping. And again, if you want to kind of learn more about this, I'm going to kind of breeze over this for time, but if you want to learn more about this activity, definitely revisit that resource at the YPAR Berkeley Hub page. And so the last piece we'll get into is really around developing and sharing what you've learned. And so you first want to really consider your stakeholders or interested parties, and this may actually happen way earlier in the evaluation process, and it may continue to happen throughout. And some types of interested parties, include staff, which can include program staff and even board members. It includes program participants like youth, like families. It can include partners like funders or sponsors or community partners. And it can include external partners like those elected officials, lobbyists, advocacy groups, and as we kind of got into earlier, some skeptics or complete opponents of your program who might completely disagree with your program's purpose. And so some things to really consider is, how will these interested parties really be involved in evaluation, and how might they use the results? And so these stakeholders or interested parties can really have a role in the process of the program and in the process of the evaluation, but they can also have a role in the products or, the findings that come out of the evaluation, or they can have a role in both. But all of them, may find evaluation results useful. And so it's really up to the evaluator or the program, if you are doing the evaluation internally, to determine who should receive evaluation products and what those products should be and how they should be delivered. And so multiple products can be produced for multiple stakeholders, and it's really considering, what that stakeholder needs. Funders may largely, be interested in explicit outcomes that outline, they may outline in their guidelines, but community partners may be more interested in outcomes related to enhancing civic engagement within the community that, may not be as important to funders, or it might be, it depends on who your funder is. And so it's really important to consider, again, what a stakeholder needs. And just remember, as I shared earlier, that the youth voice is really, the youth voice and the youth experience can be valuable in program improvement, which could be valuable to various stakeholders or interested parties. And so culturally responsive evaluations to really devote attention to the full range of individuals and groups that are invested in the program. And so they really, should seek to develop a diverse stakeholder group that is inclusive of persons both directly and indirectly affected or impacted by the program, that are representative of the community or population of the program, or of the person served by the program. And it's really important to include stakeholders with different different access to power and different types of, access to resources. And it's also important to really kind of establish trust and respect. And to get here, it's important to have meaningful roles and activities for certain stakeholders. And so Julie mentioned earlier, advisory groups. You can have youth advisory groups to engage youth more, but you can also have advisory groups that include stakeholders or folks who, have a stake in the work. These advisory groups can really help to provide insights, recommendations, and guidance to the evaluation. It's also nice to kind of check your findings with these groups. Member checking with these stakeholders is really a nice way to ensure that what you found in your evaluation resonates with other stakeholders. It's nice to do this with the youth you collect data from as well, making sure that you're checking in with them, letting them know these are my findings. Is this accurate? Is this an accurate reflection of how you experience the program? Because you want to make sure you're really amplifying their voice and not saying something completely different. And so having those member checks is really important to engage with youth and other stakeholders. And it's important to really ensure that your findings and recommendations are asset-based. And so, as I'm sure we all know, there are so many deficit notions and ideas kind of surrounding the youth that we work with. And we really want to ensure that we're not adding to that rhetoric, right? We want to really highlight and emphasize the knowledge and skills and assets of the participants and of the youth that we work with. Again, we want to consider those dominant deficit narratives and, intentionally try to, shift and change that narrative. And we want to critique systems and not individuals. And so some questions, excuse me, some questions we can ask ourselves are, what are the most positive study findings? What are the most negative or controversial? Which findings can be used to solve issues as opposed to laying blame? What does the team think who does the team think should hear about these study findings? And what are the best strategies for reaching and communicating to these people? And so these, types of questions, really recognize the deficit and dominant narrative surrounding our communities. It recognizes that, something like the war on drugs is a racial project that has disproportionately impacted communities of color, right? So being transparent in that reality is necessary, but these communities still have assets and skills that they use to navigate and resist systems and highlight ways that they do that to remain really asset-based. And then also, encourage you to be this way as well. And so these are some of the types of products that can be produced from evaluation findings. It can be, reports, slide decks, infographics, memos, webinars, social media, whether it's, videos, photos, maps, artwork, and storytelling. And so here's an example of an infographic that I worked on that really gets at the engagement of youth in their first year of college. And, really infographics can be really good at showing numbers and quantitative data. And then here's another image that was in an information sheet on walking interviews in which images and a map of the route is shown. And so again, like using a product that will be most beneficial to your stakeholder, and just remembering to really, de-identify youth in the final products of your evaluation, because they can be, vulnerable populations. And then that same resource that I mentioned earlier, the YPAR Hub, the Youth Participatory Action Resource Hub at UC Berkeley, really provides more examples of how to appropriately kind of engage youth in sharing evaluation findings. And so this can include developing structured activities that allow you to engage in sense making of the data, so similar to the active learning examples I discussed earlier. This can mean really training youth in coding qualitative data. You also want to involve youth in determining the types of final products and involve youth in presenting data to various stakeholder groups, whether it's at conferences or webinars, et cetera. So this can mean kind of, providing training and communicating with difficult people, particularly those opponents that we kind of discussed earlier. Provide training in public speaking skills, event planning, sharing your message with the media. I think some of you already do this in some of your, media campaigns or media curriculum. And, so recognizing that, some of these things you all are already maybe doing in your program. And so just highlighting those to really ensure that when it comes to the evaluation components, youth are able to do this.
Destiny,
Yes.
you go back 3 slides from the first visual slide that you did. That one, no. Right there. Nope, right there. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. I'm good.
Yeah, so that, yeah, it was just an infographic. It's focused on college students in their first year of college. This was from a survey that was collected, and we took those percentages and kind of created an image to tell a story here. And so our last activity, we won't go to the Jamboard again. We want to, definitely be aware of time, but I think it'd be nice to kind of engage in conversation around, who our stakeholders are and kind of how they will be involved in the process or the product. And so maybe what I can actually do is share the Jamboard. And maybe I can fill it in as we talk through it. So I definitely want to open up the conversation to you all, maybe in the chat or aloud. Who are your stakeholders and who are your interested parties when it comes to your program and your evaluation efforts?
Funders. The funders of our grant, the partners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see a lot in the chat. Yes, I'm saying funders, community partners, parents and families. Yeah, families.
Funders and council members, is that maybe a local government council or other ones?
Government,
Educators, tribal leaders, a lot of different stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
Executive directors, the board, funders again, community partners.
Mm-hmm.
I think youth peers is, I think, identifying other youth as stakeholders in the overall wellness, of our youth communities. Right? We have target populations that we serve, but I think recognizing that many of the members of our communities in those populations we aim to serve are also members of other overlapping communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think
definitely.
like coaches, like a lot of our kids are part of like softball teams and baseball teams and basketball teams.
Mm-hmm.
And even their employers, I think, small business owners in particular in, rural communities, tight-knit communities, have a stake in positive outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also seeing community community healers, entertainers, law enforcement leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Destiny, maybe we can take one of these and start to think through some of the questions you've got there.
Yeah. Yeah, let's take parents and families and maybe consider how might parents and families be involved in the evaluation process and or product.
I can take notes.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, I'll open it up. See you all again.
Trying to talk to a parent and kind of ask the parent, have they had a chance to talk to the youth, and the youth share with them their experiences, what the program.
Mhm. So sharing with families the experiences of youth in the program.
Also, seeing that prevention is not a single like youth oriented impact that we're trying to make. We're trying to break cycles, and families are essentially those that continue cycles. So how has programming impacted the family unit in breaking a cycle, in supporting the participants in prevention, but the impact in their home? I think it's very important to involve them in the evaluation of our services, and also asking them like what running by a few parents what the evaluation process looks like, and informing them the purpose of evaluation.
Yeah.
I also think understanding like and being mindful of like burdensome emails, canceled meetings, et cetera, for parents and families. I think having being consistent in, you know, the way that we schedule and require people to be present, is particularly parents, and also creating space for parents who, you know, may not have the ability to like just drop off and then come back, or you know, kind of creating a network amongst parents to support youth involved, youth engaged. Because if parents aren't engaged, then youth oftentimes don't even have the opportunity to engage. So kind of creating space for busy parents and parents who do want to be more engaged than others, you know, or who may not have childcare, right? Like, so sometimes it looks like if we're meeting in person or expecting youth to meet in person, we have an additional space for you know, supportive guardians or siblings that may not be directly engaged in the process, but need, you know, need a space to be while we do engage the youth.
Yeah, so having like some family-centered programming within the
Yeah.
program that kind of engages them, but also recognizing, you know, the same way we recognize youth schedules and, you know, the burden that youth are facing right now, also recognizing, you know, family schedules and the burdens that they may be facing, and being attuned to that as we try to engage them. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And then, you know, lastly, getting at that last question about what are their interests in the evaluation? I think we kind of started, you know, talking about that a little bit, ensuring that we're, you know, being transparent in the purpose of the evaluation with families and engaging them even in the design of the evaluation. What other interests might, you know, parents have in the evaluation?
I think transparency is a great one, as well as anonymity. I think, you know, people feeling safe to creating a safe space for people to share without consequence, you know, or having a negative impact on them or their youth. And also what will be done with the information. I think that's a question that we receive often, is that, you know, what's going to be done with this information, and will there be like a follow-up, right?
Absolutely.
I think it also gives them more, it engages them more in programming. Like, wow, I have a voice in what my youth is involved in. I am going to be even more intentional about being involved. So it really does make them part of the process and programming. And this is just a great way to really engage them further of support. Hey, if there's a need for programming, they are probably the people that would be coming out firsthand to come and bring in a donation because they believe in the impact, because their voices are being heard. So it really just comes full circle in engaging them.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so recognizing kind of what we talked about earlier, that cycle and trying to, you know, break cycles and understanding the impact of the program, really engaging them and you know, including them in the evaluation too, to understand how to improve the program for not just youth, but families as well. Any final thoughts around this, around, you know, interested stakeholders, how families may be involved, and, you know, the interest families may have in evaluation?
I think oftentimes, like those of us who work in research spaces and are engaged with community, you know, I think sometimes we make assumptions about people's true understanding of something like evaluation. You know, because I think, you know, oftentimes we've experienced or have training in the importance of evaluation in shaping programs, but I think really breaking that down, like really breaking down what evaluation is and what it's truly used for and why it's so important in our community. So I think just like an overall, like just expansion on what evaluation really is and who does it and why they do it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, going back to, you know, really being clear and transparent with families on, you know, what we're doing, what it is, what the purpose is, and how we will really, you know, try to protect them in this process as well, protect their identity, remain anonymous.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you all so much for engaging in this activity. I think it's, you know, really important, of course, to really consider who our stakeholders are, and how we engage them, and, you know, how they may be involved in both the product and the process. And so kind of beginning to wrap up here. So, you know, in this webinar today, we really engaged in kind of discussing a few of the qualitative methods that can be utilized in program evaluation. We really got at kind of developing and sharing findings and engaging both youth and stakeholders throughout the process. And so our first webinar that is on the Elevate Youth California website under the training and webinars page was really on understanding what evaluation is and why we use it. We talked about clarifying our purpose, defining our evaluation questions, understanding evaluation approaches, and really developing that, or beginning to develop really a logic model or theory of action. And again, you can find that on Elevate Youth California's website. And if you'd like more one-on-one coaching, we do provide that. There's a Google form that will, you know, also continue to be emailed out. But when this is posted on this slideshow will be posted on Elevate Youth California's website. There is a link here that goes to the Google form that you'd fill out if you are interested in some individual coaching or 1-hour sessions. This also has a link to provide some feedback on this session. And again, some past webinars that we provide. Learning for Action, as I mentioned earlier, also has some webinars up on, you know, photo voice and really more of those methods that I didn't get into too much today. If you want to, like, you know, learn more about surveys, focus groups, journey scrolls, most significant change, and more, definitely check them out. They're also on the training and webinars page. They also are doing individual consultations on these topics. And then the Youth Leadership Institute also has individual coaching that's focused on policy, advocacy, strategic action planning, building relationships with decision makers, and racial and social justice. So definitely check those out. Reach out to myself or Julie with any questions that you may have. Our emails are here, but you can also, again, when this is posted, find it on the webinar page. And I do want to kind of also turn your attention to the resources that we provide at the end of the slide deck. So we have resources around evaluation, the pyramid, the type pyramid that Julie discussed, some resources on culturally responsive and youth participatory evaluation, some resources on what theories of action are and developing them. And then some more resources on testimonials, autoethnography, and walking interview. And thank you, Brianna. She just put the link in the chat for the individual coaching session to sign up. And that is all we have for you today. Thank you all so much for participating in this webinar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Definitely don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck in your work, and please reach out if we can help you.
And really quickly, is it possible for us to get all of those links that you just shared from the 2 different slides? Because if we just watch the video, we won't have the links.
Yeah, so the slides will also be posted. And I'll make sure that before they're posted, I'll put the link of the Jamboard in the slide. So you should be able to click it once you get the
Okay,
slide.
thank you.
No problem. Go ahead and